Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me live in Studio 47 is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific, especially because we finally have been allocated a new home, Studio 47.
It looks exciting, and I look forward to our interaction today. A warm welcome to you all, our Facebook followers are watching us from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask real questions and talk to Shaka himself. Shaka, let us start over here in the United States. Something remarkable happened this morning. The President of the United States fired his own Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson. Your thoughts?
Very interesting, of course, but let's face it, the president, of course, as you know, has the right to hire and fire. So if you are Secretary Rex Tillerson, you know that the president is the guy, is the boss, and that is where the buck stops, and you serve at the discretion of the president.
A lot of people who've been watching the politics play out here in Washington, they would say that, for example, that the writing was on the wall. It was just a question of time when Mr. Tillerson was going to be fired. Do you agree with that kind of assessment?
I mean, let's face it. There was a time that the Secretary of State used some very, very uncomplimentary adjectives to describe his boss. And in fact, you have to give credit to President Trump, because that is probably the time when he would have fired him. He didn't. And so you have to give him some kind of credit for being at least a bit tolerant. But as we heard, the president apparently told the media that he and the secretary, now the former secretary, by the way, they had sharp disagreements on policy issues, including the issue of Iran, the Iran nuclear type of business, you know that.
Some critics would argue that maybe what happened today is akin to maybe somebody like in a third world country or a dictatorship making decisions, firing their Secretary of State on Twitter.
You could probably be correct, but then again, this is a new medium. I mean, it reminds me of some African presidents firing some of their cabinet ministers via radio or television. And but let's face it, at some point, those same cabinet members, ministers, were in fact hired through the same basis. They were basically told by other people that they had heard over the radio or television that they had actually fallen into things.
Before his firing, he just was on a trip to 5 African countries, and there, of course, he was representing the United States. In some cases, he signed some pacts with these different governments. These pacts that were signed on behalf of the United States still relevant, or they are null and void now that he's no longer the Secretary of State?
Very relevant, obviously, and that is the beauty of having a government, serving a government, having strong institutions, not strong men. This former secretary, I hate to say this, but former Secretary Rex Tillerson was not doing some of those things that you mentioned as a favor or as a personal favor or that kind of stuff. He was carrying out duties of the government of the United States. So the person who succeeds him, we gather that it might in fact be the former chief of the Central Intelligence Agency, Mike Pompeo, will pick up the ball and run with it.
Shaka, some people would say that Secretary Tillerson quit his career where he had done a stellar job. He had been serving as one of the top executives in this country for Chevron. He quit that job to come and take up the mantle of being a Secretary of State. To me, that's something where he had to actually almost forego his entire pay cut to come and work for government. But to be dismissed in such a manner is not something that I would characterize as a positive thing. It's a disgrace, or he's being fired. Your reaction to that kind of assessment?
Well, first of all, let's face it. You're talking about a guy that was obviously making a lot of money. He had deep pockets, and he was having a job obviously that took plenty of his time and what have you, but he was very hugely rewarded. But let's face it, he was also, at the same time, given an opportunity by the President of the United States to serve his people, serve his nation. And as a matter of fact, he responded on hearing that he was sacked or fired, whatever word you may want to use, that he thanked the President for having given him the opportunity for serving his nation. And so it is a great opportunity, it is an honor, it is a privilege to get in a position like that and have an opportunity to make some contributions to your country, to the government of your country, to your people. So it's different from really making money and having an opportunity to serve your people.
What's at stake? Mike Pompeo, who has been named as the possible replacement for Secretary Tillerson, of course, is coming from a totally different field. He was head of CIA. But what's at stake for him as he takes on the mantle to be the next Secretary of State?
First of all, his job is obviously cut out for him because he will always remember that his predecessor, somehow, was fired via Twitter. But the fact of the matter is, being in charge of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, doesn't really make you like a stranger to national security issues, because you are part of that national security, team that, in fact, probably on a daily basis, actually, traditionally briefs the President of the United States. So I don't think that it is foreign territory for him. But he, like I said again, his work is cut out for him. But he has been on board for quite some time. He probably understands the style of his boss and all that kind of stuff. So he will figure out how to, somehow to blend in.
Let's go to Facebook comment from Abasogi Osman. Now that former U.S. Secretary of State has concluded his visit to 5 African countries, including Nigeria, with a promise to help in achieving long-term security and development goals. How do you think that the U.S. can help bolster the security situation in Africa?
I honestly don't know how, except that I would have looked at, for example, some of the deals or agreements entered into or signed by the former Secretary Tillerson. I have not seen those. But again, as we said a bit earlier, whatever engagements he was involved in, whatever kind of deals he cut, whatever kinds of agreements he signed and what have you, he signed those things. He entered into those engagements not in the interest of himself as an individual. It was on behalf of the government of the United States. So as I said a bit earlier, the person that succeeds him, who happens to be Pompeo, the former, of course, chief again of the CIA, will pick up the ball. Will pick up the ball and move on. Life goes on, man.
Okay, let's cross over to East Africa. Let's go to Kenya. Last week, the president of Kenya and long-time opposition leader Raila Odinga finally agreed to work together in a sort of a joint kind of operation. I don't know what kind of arrangement they have. The details are still coming out. Bring us up to speed. What have you gathered since then?
Well, first of all, it's very interesting that that event happened and occurred, interestingly, on a Friday last week, when in fact Kenya was expecting the now former, of course, Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, to land in the country. And of course to hold meetings with the president and senior government officials and what have you. But I think that given what I have seen, what I have read, what I have heard, and all that kind of stuff, it seems to me like a positive step in the right direction. You're talking about a situation where a country was in a situation where, for example, the economy seemed to be tanking. A lot of investors really were very, very skeptical were not finding it easy to think about doing usual business or normal business with Kenya. Because obviously the country seemed to be divided in two different spheres, really. You have those people that support the person that is referred to as the major opposition leader, even though in terms of the architecture, in terms of the structure of the Kenyan government, you don't actually have the ruling party and opposition parties. You have majority party and minority party, you know, that kind of stuff. But of course you can lose, let's say, in the opposition. The opposition seems to really have a lot of people, and you could actually sort of, you know, like say that with a lot of confidence, especially given what you saw at Uhuru Park, Nairobi on January 30th, where Raila Odinga somehow took some kind of oath, thereby making him as the people's president. And it was very interesting in the sense that when President Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga met outside Harambee House, addressing the media and the Kenyan people and what have you, the memo that was put together by State House staffers, it was very interesting, you know, Paul, that it was addressing both Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga as His Excellency. I mean, can you believe that?
Interesting.
That's almost suggesting that Kenya actually does have the distinction of having two presidents. They were also, by the way, very cautiously not referring to each other as either President, you know, President Uhuru Kenyatta or former, you know, Prime Minister Raila Odinga. They were instead referring to each other as my brother, my brother. And if you looked at the body language, it looked really like it was real.
Shaka, that's a perfect segue to go to the next comment. Let's go to Brian Kaija Wambale in Kampala, Uganda. He says, what do you think of the joint leadership of Kenyan government having two presidents and two vice presidents after President Uhuru Kenyatta reached out to opposition figure Raila Odinga?
Like I said, of course, earlier, again, it was a positive step in the right direction. Now, they say that, yes, you may have agreed to talk about the talks and what have you, but the devil remains in the details. So we really cannot say much until, frankly, these people, you know, the people that they chose as some kind of task force or whatever, come up with some kind of recommendations and all that kind of stuff, and to see whether, in fact, some of these issues that each of them is actually talking about can actually be implemented and executed. So I think the jury really you know, remains out there.
How about the fact that there are some people who argue that Raila Odinga, for example, is an opportunist? He seizes, you know, how he knows how to seize a moment and takes advantage of it. For example, he undercut his core NASA principles. It looks like that they were not in agreement for him to go ahead and negotiate a deal of some sort with the president. What does that make him?
Well, of course, they are entitled to their opinion. There's no question about that. But I don't know really whether they are also entitled to their own different sets of facts. Because the fact of the matter is politics is about opportunism. Politics is about the art, can be defined as the art of all possibilities.
But at the expense of the people?
No. It is not at the expense of the people. It may look like at the expense of the core leaders in NASA, but certainly not the people, because in fact he was representing the interests of the people.
Which people?
And if you listen, the people of Kenya. And if you listened to what in fact was in the memo, the issues that he had been talking about, for example, as an individual, as a leader, as a member of NASA, the issue of, for example, electoral justice, the issue of the independence of the judiciary system, the issue of devolution, the issue of police brutality, and what have you. Those things are, in fact, in that in that MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding. So I think, again, like I said earlier, sincerely, I don't think that is really appropriate for us to come to any conclusion until we see the details and until we actually see whether the recommendations that will come out can actually be implemented and executed. Those people who say that the man is an opportunist, again, let's face it, they must be naive, because politics is about who gets what, when, how, where, and all that kind of stuff. And the other thing is that they are also, at the same time, people who are characterizing Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta, and both of them, as statesmen, as people, frankly, who have risen to the occasion, something that a lot of people did not expect. The Americans, for example, have congratulated them, and you had, of course, former Secretary Tillerson commend them. You had the UN Secretary General also commend them. I have not sincerely had people having a problem with that, except with his NASA core principles and some very, very few people. As a matter of fact, those people met yesterday with his core principles, Raila, Musalia Mudavadi, Kalonzo Musyoka, and Moses Wetangula. They met in Nairobi and issued a statement, a very positive statement, that in fact they joined forces in supporting the event on Friday outside Harambee House in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi.
But the ordinary person, Shaka, the ordinary person who put their lives on the line for Raila Odinga, they are not going to benefit from this MOU.
No, we really do not know. Again, we don't know because I said we have to wait about the details that will come out of the task force that has been formed, the recommendations that will come up, and exactly what is going to be done about them or not done about them. What you are telling me is something that I'm hearing from one so-called General Joshua Miguna, who, as I talk, probably is in Toronto, who happens to be the guy that is in charge of what is called the NRM, the National Resistance Movement. But let's face it, he does not really represent the ordinary average Kenyan so far. You saw he tried to run as to run for governorship in Nairobi County. I don't think that he got more than 8,000 votes out of more than 2 million human beings who call Nairobi home.
Well, Shaka, let's cross over to another question. Still in East Africa, let's go to Muhimbise Gadias, Dennis, in Kampala, Uganda. Who is the most favorable leader in Africa for you, Shaka?
I think that is a very ambiguous question. Very difficult question, therefore, to answer, really. First of all, when you say favorite to who? Favorite to the people that this individual leads? Favorite to people who are observers and therefore, for example, like the Mo Ibrahim Foundation recently granted an award for good governance and for good governance and for a president who had been elected democratically, completed, her 2 terms as president of Liberia. We're talking about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, now former president of Liberia. She was honored with the Mo Ibrahim Award. And therefore, perhaps the Mo Ibrahim Award would actually argue that as far as they are concerned, she's probably the most favorite, leader.
But who is your favorite leader?
Then, if you look at the foreigners, for example.
No, I want your favorite leader.
Well, the thing is, I don't think that, frankly, I am in a position to come up with my favorite leader, because I don't think that that would really leave me with the kind of integrity that I must have, character and what have you, in the context of practicing my craft, which is journalism, which is making an observation. I can only tell you what other people think about some of these presidents. For example, a lot of people in the Western world, when you talk about who is a great president or what have you, they will probably tell you the Rwandan president, Major General Paul Kagame, retired. There are a lot of people who talk about that. And when you meet a lot of other people in Africa and whatever, you say, wait a minute, we don't really think that is the man. But you know what? When you look at some of these leaders in Africa, you can probably go to Southern Africa, go to a country called Botswana, where there is a president called Ian Khama. Even though last time when I interviewed him, he told me that his names, in fact, were Seretse Khama, Ian Khama. Seretse Khama is the name of his father, who happens to be the founding president of Botswana. And so he combines that name with his name, Ian Khama, as the first president of Botswana, and hence his names. He probably is someone that a lot of people sincerely find to be probably to fit that sort of category, that kind of question, because he has presided over a country that has good economy. He has served his almost 2 terms with 1 year remaining. He's stepping down next month so that his vice president can succeed him. He's also the only other person, frankly, that I can remember that had the guts, the confidence, to be able to criticize, for example, former Zimbabwean president Robert Gabriel Mugabe when he was in office. He's also someone who stuck with the fact that when a lot of other African leaders were trying to get out of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in The Hague, he said, wait a minute, you actually signed those commitments. And because you signed those commitments, you have to respect them.
Okay, let's move along. Let's go to Liberia. Ambassador Erica Polyp Collins in Monrovia, he says, with the great leaders in Africa passing on, can the new breed of young African leaders unite Africa politically?
Well, first of all, it depends what he means by a new breed of African leaders. There was a time when, for example, that concept originated here during the Bill Clinton administration. And they looked at the president of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki. They looked at the prime minister then of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi. They looked at Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni. They looked at Paul Kagame in Rwanda. And in fact, to a certain degree, they also looked at Laurent Desire Kabila of the Democratic Republic of Congo and characterized them as a new breed of African leaders, the beacons of hope for African democracy. But my friend, when you go to Asmara, through Addis Ababa, Kampala, Kigali, and Kinshasa, you probably wouldn't find anything close to democracy. In fact, someone suggested that instead of saying a new breed of African leaders, perhaps those people, in fact, should have been characterized as a new breed of African dictators. Now, you know, the only way any country can get a good leader depends on how those people are mobilized, organized so much so that they can, in fact, make their leaders or presidents or whatever you call them accountable to them. Because at the end of the day, the people are the sovereign. It is not an individual that occupies State House that, in fact, is the power. Power is vested in the people. But for the most part, we've seen in the continent, it is simply lip service. The people who occupy State House talk about how our power belongs to the people. But in fact, in reality, power belongs to those individuals. And those individuals are not accountable to their people. Instead, they actually abuse them. They do all sorts of bad things towards them, and they don't really deliver services. They don't hold, for example, elections that you would consider to be fair, you know, free, to be credible, to be transparent, to be verifiable. They simply rule, in fact, by the fact that they control 2 things. Control the gun, the AK-47, the police, the intelligence services, and the treasury. They don't care about the people.
Shaka, we're almost running out of time, but what's up on tap for tomorrow?
Very interesting, in fact, is that tomorrow we're going to be talking about the U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson's trip to Africa. So we'll probably look at it as a trip of a former U.S. Secretary of State. Figure out what did he in fact accomplish. The question is, did he in fact accomplish much really, because he didn't even seem to have actually made news until he arrived in Washington, only to be made with obviously a Twitter that suggested that he may actually go back to Texas.
Shaka, there is a comment coming in here on Facebook. Somebody says that all they're hearing is you criticizing African leaders. What makes a great African leader?
I have already answered that. What makes a great African leader is a person, for example, that is, in fact, genuinely elected by the people, so that the results of that election, which is actually held, reflects the will of those people who went to the votes, but not a reflection of the individual that announces the results. And a person who listens to his people, who consults his people before they make very big decisions that eventually are going to affect their people. My job is an observer. And as an observer, you are entitled sometimes to come up with what appears to be criticism. Criticism is part of democracy. Democracy is a messy type of system of government. Even Churchill himself, the one-time great Prime Minister of Britain, he talked about, for example, how democracy is the worst form of government. But if you compare it with the others that we know, it is terrific. There's no question about it. But in a democracy, you expect debates, you expect criticism, you expect people to argue, you expect disagreements and what have you. But that is the beauty of democracy, because at the end of the day, the sausage that comes out of that kind of interaction and what have you and dynamics and stuff like that is good for at least the common denominator of people who live in that particular neighborhood.
Well, Shaka, it looks like we've run out of time. On that note, thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time, maybe in about 3 weeks.
You're most welcome, and of course, have a pleasant and fruitful trip.
Well, to you all our viewers, thank you for sending in those comments. We look forward to joining you with another edition of Shaka Extra Time next week. I'll be away, but somebody will be filling in for me. Thank you, and have a good night.